You guys are on text page 206, Blue Notebook page 182, and we're on lesson 4.2, and we're doing completing the square. So we'll see. This may be a 2-day lesson. We'll hopefully try to get it in one and see what happens. So copy, completing the square down, and the need to know. It's pretty important. Essentially, what completing the square is, we're moving an equation from our standard form into our vertex form, okay? So there's quite a few steps to this. It's kind of a reverse of what we were doing yesterday. We're going to go right on to text page 210, question 2b. And we're going to try completing the square for this one. So the question says f at x is equal to negative 2x squared plus 16x plus 1. Okay. So in your very first step, since our, you know what, I'll write the standard equation above it just so you guys can see how they relate to each other. Okay, so if you guys take a look at this, our a in this equation is negative 2. So because this is negative 2, I need to actually find a common factor of our first two terms, okay? So I'm not finding a common factor, including the c, just a common factor in our ax squared plus bx. In this case, it's negative 2x squared plus 16x. Can anyone think of a common factor? Negative 2x. In this case, what we're going to do is this common factor, we're not going to take variables out with it. We're going to leave the variables in. I just need a common factor of the coefficients, okay? So we had negative 2 like you guys said. So we're taking negative 2 out. We take negative 2 out, and inside the brackets, when I divide each of those terms by negative 2, I'm left with x squared. And I divide this by negative 2, negative 8x plus 1 on the outside. So all I've done now is taken out a coefficient, greatest common factor of our coefficients. I've taken the negative 2 out. So I've created an x squared minus 8x. This is where it starts to get tricky. So in our next line, what we need to do is our term, sorry, wrong one, our negative 8x here, we need to divide it in half and then square it. So whatever this number is, I'm going to divide it in half and square it. So I'm going to write that on the side. In fact, we'll do it in blue. Since technically this is still our b term, it's our b term after we've taken out a greatest common factor coefficient. So our b has changed a little. It's now negative 8. We're going to take this negative 8 to the outside. We're going to divide it by 2 and square it. Whatever that number becomes, we're going to put it back into the equation. So this is first of all, the tricky part. So what is negative 8 divided by 2? 4. Just 4? Negative 4. What is negative 4 squared? 16. Okay. So this 16 is very important. I'm going to add and subtract it to the equation. So I'm going to show you what that looks like, and I'm going to talk to you about why that can be done. Actually, what I'll do is I'm just going to erase this part and write it a little lower. So negative 2x squared. I keep my negative 8x, that term I used over here. I keep it in the equation. It's the 16 that's important. I take the 16 and I'm going to add 16 and subtract 16 inside the brackets, plus 1. Now, the reason I'm able to do this, I add and subtract 16. When I put those two terms together, what does that become? 0. So it's just like I'm adding 0 inside the brackets. It doesn't really change the equation if I add 0. So that number I take, I put it inside the brackets. I add and subtract 16. So this is very important here. Many people forget this step. Once I've done that, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be moving my negative 16 outside of the brackets. And the whole reason we're doing this is we're trying to create a perfect square inside the brackets. So you're going to see what I mean by that. So I bring down my negative 2, x squared minus 8x plus 16. And like I said, I need to move this negative 16 outside of the brackets. Now, the only problem with that is when I go to move negative 16 outside of the brackets, technically there is a coefficient in front. And with our math rules, I have to technically distribute this negative 2 into all the numbers inside if I'm distributing. In this case, I'm just trying to remove negative 16. So when I bring negative 16 outside of the brackets, I have to multiply it by this negative 2 or whatever the coefficient is on the outside. So I take my negative 16, I multiply it by the number here. In this case, it happens to be negative 2. I end up with, anyone know? Positive 32. So when I brought it to the outside of the brackets, positive 32 comes outside of the brackets. And I still have my plus 1. Now I'm going to combine those, try to make this simpler right now. Minus 8x plus 16. Now 32 plus 1, 33, very easy. Okay, now the whole reason I've gone through these weird steps is what I've been doing is I'm creating, if you guys remember from our earlier chapters, I've created a perfect square inside the brackets. Our first term, our a, this is our a squared, and our b squared. I can find the square root of 16. I can find a square root of x squared. And I know when I multiply them by 2, they're going to give me this middle term in here. So what that means is if I were to factor, if I were to go about factoring this part, okay? You know what? I'll do the factoring on the side just so you guys can see. Normally we don't write the factoring step in. So I'm going to factor that term on the outside. I'm going to take our brackets. I'm quickly going to factor them on the left here. Now you don't normally have to do this. I'm just showing you what I'm doing in my head. This is why you guys need to be strong with what we were doing before. So factors of the first term, 1 and 1. Factors of the other term, 1, 16, 4 and 4. We know that they have to add up to what? Negative 8. So real quickly, 1 times 4, 1 times 4. I know that's going to give me 4 and 4, but what has to be special about these 4s? They both have to be negative. Which makes sense because negative 4 times negative 4 is still going to give me positive 16. So when I go to write this in brackets, I have my x minus 4, x minus 4. Now is there another way I can write x minus 4, right? Exactly. I can write that as x minus 4 squared. Now, if you do all these steps above properly, you really don't have to go through this factoring step. You can just go right into changing this here, our x squared minus 8x plus 16, into x minus 4 squared. We know it's going to work. You can factor it to check to make sure you've done the steps above properly, but it's a lot of extra work in a sense. So my next line is negative 2, and I replace these brackets with this term here, our x minus 4 squared. Because I know when it's factored, it's equal to that. So I put in x minus 4 squared plus 33. And if you guys now notice, I know this is kind of in the way here. We'll try to separate it a little. If you guys notice, what form are we in right now? Quadratic. Not quadratic. Vertex form. Very good. We are in our vertex form. So that was quite a few steps to go from standard form to our vertex form. So what I'm going to get you guys to do right now, it's very nice to watch me do this, but there are many steps to remember on this. The only way you guys are going to remember it is by practicing it. So I'm going to get you guys to practice a question right now, then we'll take it up on the board, and then move to a more difficult question with this. So I want you guys to work on text page 214, number 5A right now for 5 minutes. See if you guys can